There are a lot of powerful old men in the Souls games. Allant, Gwyn, Vendrick, Gael, and let's not forget Gehrman and Godfrey and Isshin. True, not from Souls games per se, but as good as. But which of these old men is the strongest? Why, if they were to duke it out, who comes out on top? My name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and maybe we'll find out, I don't know. I've done a similar video for the player characters of these games, and I also did one talking about the various kingdoms, Lordran versus Drangleic, for example. But which of these old men, some of them kings, some of them remarkably buff, comes out the victor? Well, whether you think it'd turn out like this, or like this.
Will I let you die? Giant souls, wee moth.
They harden in response to PlayStation exclusives. You can't hurt me, Gehrman.
What did I just say?
Let's have some fun and speculate on it, shall we? And remember that it is just for fun. There's no concrete answers either way. There's no right and there's no wrong. First up, let's look at some stats. As people have complained that I didn't take a scientific enough approach, they want to know, well, Gwyn can punch with enough force to crack 3 units of concrete or something like that. Keep in mind, part of the reason I didn't include those sort of figures is that we just have absolutely no way of knowing how tall these characters are or how much they weigh and so on. There's nothing that really relates to real life in that sense, so it's really silly to make that sort of comparison. It would be like, for example, saying that Sephiroth is able to destroy the entire solar system because of that supernova attack, even though that completely negates the whole point of Final Fantasy VII, where Sephiroth wanted to get the black materia, which basically made like a meteor. Why would he do that if he can just cast supernova anytime he wants and wipe out the entire universe? Anyway, the player character in Dark Souls could be 4 feet tall, for all we know. But for the sake of it, let's assume that every player character is 6 foot tall, exactly, just as that's a nice, even number. The characters are often rather small compared to NPCs and bosses, but that's largely just for gameplay reasons. But all the same, I'll try and figure out some rough heights, and yes, I'm going to assume Wolf is 6 foot tall as well, even if people think he's the size of a True. We will also assume that 1 unit of weight is 1 pound. Not strictly accurate, but it's the easiest way to look at things, and there's a lot of equivalence between the games, such as longswords weighing about 3 units in almost every game. I think they're like 3.5 in Elden Ring, but whatever. 3 pounds for a longsword isn't too far off, even if other weights do become complete nonsense. Operating under that assumption, here's roughly how they stack up. Whilst it's a lot harder to judge weight, we can almost certainly say that Godfrey would have the most mass, considering his very muscular form. And that's not counting the giant beast he slumbered with either. So if we wanted to look at this purely from a realistic point of view, Godfrey and Vendrick are so much larger than the others that they would stomp them. Contrary to what movies and the like may portray, it is very rarely feasible to physically best someone twice your size and weight. There is a reason that weight classes exist in things like boxing, as an example. So how about some in-game stats. Well, Gwyn's in particular are a little unfair, as we can hardly say that is Gwyn in his prime. Would the Lord of Sunlight have more health and endurance than the Lord of Cinder? Perhaps, but he would almost certainly have had many more souls during his prime, especially if you consider that it's almost certain that Gwyn divided his Lord's soul up, granting some to Seath, some to the Four Kings. The game flat out tells us that he bequeathed most of his power to the gods. Both Seath and the Four Kings drop 60,000 souls, so I think it's reasonable to say that Gwyn's soul power at his prime would be measured at least around 190,000, but doubtless much higher even than that. If he gave away most of his power and it still measures in at 70,000, right? Then we have Gael. Obviously he was a lot shorter initially, but during our final encounter with him, he swells, both for gameplay reasons and, well, it's commensurately with the number of souls he's been devouring, we can assume. Soul power is a rather useful metric in these games that functions both from a story and gameplay perspective, blends them quite nicely. But of course, even if we compare soul power between entries, it makes it a lot harder to compare souls with, say, runes or blood echoes or, well, experience in Shadowside Twice. Vendrick's an interesting case. Those stats are for the hollow version we can encounter. Vendrick's soul is not in his possession, it's locked away. As with Gwyn, we can assume his prime power is quite a lot higher, the secondary figure seeming about right. Another interesting part of Vendrick is his incredible durability. Even as a naked, unarmoured hollow, he is incredibly sturdy. The bearer of the curse needs the giant souls to be able to really deal any meaningful amount of damage to Vendrick. The giant's resentment of Vendrick softens him up, you might say. But if you don't have any giant souls, well, he becomes a lot tankier, like 32 times, something like that. Then we have King Allant, or to be more precise, his demon. The true form of Allant is a blob by the time we find him, so it's very hard to gauge his true strength, and it's possible that he would have been considerably weaker than even his demon, which presumably resembles him as a perfect doppelganger. But strength-wise, clues as to that are very scarce, other than the fact that Allant is taken aback that his demon was defeated, the insatiable hunger of the slayer of demons surprising him. But otherwise, the demon seems to be operating at full strength, as do Gael and Gehrman and Isshin. Although in Gehrman's case, he's been in the Hunter's Dream for a indeterminate amount of time, and his willpower seems to be suffering as he wishes for an end to it all. He doesn't want to be in that dream. Whilst it's possible Gehrman was stronger when he was younger, I don't think it would matter much, as despite being a decrepit old man, physically, he's extremely spry, so I'm assuming the dream means he's more or less always at his best, physically, even if he's in a wheelchair. He does eagerly stand up and begin pummeling you. As for Isshin, well, there's two versions of him. The old dying version, who is still intimidating enough that the government waited for him to pass before invading Ashina, and still puts up a pretty good fight against Wolf. And then during one of the game's, well, true endings, however you care to look at it, we fight what is presumably Isshin resurrected at his prime. His height, in particular, is interesting. During the opening, he appears to be normal-sized, whereas the guy he's fighting is practically twice his size. Once again, this is probably just for cinematic, aesthetic purposes. And I'm fairly certain that characters have different scaling models too. One model for cutscenes and one for gameplay, and then obviously another for CGI. All the same, we'll go by the best thing we can measure, his height compared to Wolf, which would make him 8 feet tall, and the general he killed in the opening, well, Godfrey sized. I mean, at least that gives you a sort of an idea of how big Isshin would be against Godfrey and Vendrick. Likewise, as Shadows Die Twice works rather different to Souls, it's not like he really has a soul value, nor do his hit points translate as easily because, of course, in that game it's more about breaking posture than draining health. As for Godfrey, I think he's likewise at full power, other than his axe being broken, but that's probably not going to be a huge hindrance in the grand scheme of things. You might assume he was stronger when he was the first Elden Lord, but I don't see any particular reason as to why he'd be weaker when we encounter him at the end of the game. Of course, his grace is arguably missing, but that's probably more just because we can't fight a respawning boss. And considering that he was resurrected and came back, I'm going to assume that means he does have the grace in his eyes. How about what each of them has at their disposal? King Allant's demon is wielding Soulbrand, ignoring the fact that the actual Allant seems to have it, which scales with demonic power. Considering it is being used by a demon, we can assume it has the maximum attack rating, 500. Otherwise, Allant has no armor, unless there's like armor under that ceremonial sort of robe he's wearing, and we don't know of any other tools that he has. Gwyn uses a greatsword, although we don't know how much stronger it would be when he wields it, because his is imbued with fire, unlike the player version, which is just a mundane one, absent from his power. Other than his sword, Gwyn does use miracles, sunlight spears at the very least, but I think it's safe to assume he can use any lightning-based miracle, discounting those that were specifically created after his time, or otherwise wouldn't make sense for him to use. Looking at the Soul of Cinder and Nameless King gives us an idea of the other sort of miracles he probably would have been able to use. His armor is largely bereft of power by the time we get our hands on it, but still gives decent protection. His robe, for example, is almost as much defense as the basic plate knight armor, which says a lot about that magical god garment. Vendrick, meanwhile, is wearing a full kingly raiment of armor, along with his crown, and he has a good shield, a sword, and a greatsword at his disposal. Technically, it's a greatsword and an ultra greatsword, but meh. The stats required for his items suggest that he used a quality build, at least, if not one of every stat, being able to use miracles, sorceries, hexes, and the like. The last of which being the most likely, as the Hollow Vendrick is able to use a form of cursed projectile on the player, which is probably a hex. So quality melee and hex magic seems likely to me. His main blade also scales with the number of souls in one's grasp, so at his prime, you need to add a good chunk onto his base attack rating with that weapon. Unlike the kings, Gael on the other hand uses shoddy, rusty, broken equipment, but equipment he knows well, having fought countless battles on his long journey. In many ways, he is used both to represent the player character's journey and as a foil to the player character. There's nothing really noteworthy about his gear, but he's an expert at wielding it. He's also able to use some basic miracles. Gehrman is much like Gael in that he uses rather mundane equipment at first glance. He wears rags and uses a farming tool in battle, but none would doubt his skill at the hunt. And his burial blade is considered a masterwork of engineering, because you have to remember that, well, it's not just a scythe, it's a scythe that can transform, and it's made with an ore said to have fallen from the heavens, which is presumably an extremely high quality metal. He's very adept at using that unique weapon too. The hundreds of graves in his arena would suggest that he's been releasing hunters for quite some time. None have bested him yet. There's little to indicate that he uses any form of outright magic, largely just skill. His gun is his main form of projectile, though he does have some sort of arcane ability, which could be him channeling the power of the moon presence for that almost one-hit kill area attack. And much like Gehrman, Sword Saint Isshin relies almost entirely on pure skill. He is a weapon master, hence his sobriquet Kensei. There's nothing really noteworthy about his armor, no doubt it's about the best you can get in Sengoku era Japan, but the black mortal blade he uses is about the only mystical thing about his equipment. And that's not something he'd normally have only in his reborn state. He has a firearm and a large spear at his disposal, and whilst it's not outright magic, he can redirect lightning bolts at his enemies. Still, would that work on Gwyn's lightning? If we're going with the version we fight, then he has no armor, strictly speaking, only that blue robe. Although we do know he possesses a suit of armor used in the opening, but he does have the mortal blade, and a helmet, which I suppose is one of the more important bits of armor. Godfrey has an axe and some elaborate garb which is much like Gwyn's, but for the most part, he seems to prefer pure physical force. Oh, he can certainly bash with his axe, but he doesn't need it, which might give him a rather distinct advantage in some ways. With most of the others, if you disarm them, what are they going to do? Oh, certainly some have miracles and magic, but Godfrey doesn't need armor, doesn't need a weapon, and even then he's basically at his full strength. Indeed, you might say he is a full strength build, whereas Isshin is more of a quality build leaning towards dexterity. Vendrick's an all-rounder. Gwyn and Gael are strength faith, although Gael has a little more leaning towards quality because he does use that crossbow. And the False King is similar to Gael, but with sorcery instead of miracles. Gehrman, meanwhile, is the opposite of Gwyn. He's dexterity and arcane. With all that in mind, I don't think I really need to go into feats and all that much. Gwyn led an army and defeated the ancient dragons, he fought against the demons, Vendrick subdued the giants, Isshin freed Ashina, Gael went on a long journey all by his lonesome, and Godfrey was lord of the battlefield, fighting campaigns for Queen Marika, crushing all of her opponents. Gehrman defeated hundreds of other hunters, we can assume from the gravestones, and the False King, well, we don't really know what he got up to. Who is the strongest, though? What do you think? If you ask me, Isshin is the weakest in the sense that he has very little magic and supernatural powers, save for his mortal blade. But for the most part, he has nothing but pure skill to carry him. He's just a man with a sword. But as it happens, that is a lot of skill. And would his black mortal blade work against the divinity of the others? I don't think so in that sense. See, the black mortal blade, Kaimon, can bring back the dead, whereas Fushigiri, the red blade, can sever immortality. Together they control life and death, so Wolf, having both of them in that one ending is rather terrifying, sure, but in my opinion, Kaimon wouldn't really help in dealing with the special defenses of the others. So it just comes down to, does Isshin possess enough skill to defeat them? I do believe he could defeat the False King, as in the end that is nothing more than a puppet. A powerful one, but able to be struck down all the same. Against Gwyn, I unfortunately think Isshin would succumb to his flames or his lightning. Maybe not the lightning if he can redirect them. That's the thing. Gwyn throws his lightning, Isshin tries to redirect it, he either manages it, or he can't redirect it because it's magic and he gets, well, crispied. Against Vendrick, Isshin would struggle against his defenses. I would say that Godfrey being twice Isshin's size would make it a sure thing, but the opening cinematic shows us that Isshin is able to defeat huge adversaries, meaning I think he actually stands a decent chance against Godfrey. It would probably be his most even matchup, in my opinion. That said, I think if Godfrey managed to land a hit, it would be game over for Isshin. And it's important to remember just how many battles Godfrey went through. He was considered the lord of the battlefield. He's not a pushover. Gehrman and Isshin would be another good match. It'd be a really hard one to call. Each of them has a firearm, a polearm, and a sword. Sort of, kind of, sword. But I think Isshin's equipment would give him a slight edge here, but it's a very hard one to call. As for Gehrman, honestly, I can only really see him standing a chance against Isshin, the False King, and possibly Godfrey. Whilst he undeniably has skill, the power of Gwyn's miracles and Vendrick's defenses are just what I would consider insurmountable for him. In Vendrick's case, I'm not sure any of the others have enough raw power to deal with him outside of Gwyn and Gael, who were able to use fearsome magical attacks to chip away, even with his huge defensive modifiers. Godfrey would be needing to punch him many times. False King is the odd one here. I think he's very powerful, but I'm not sure how much that raw power would work in his favour against similar opponents. Here's a weird way to look at it. Imagine the False King is a tank. Sure, he can roll over infantrymen, but if he's up against another tank, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to automatically win, and in some cases these other tanks are bigger and have better armour and more firepower. I actually think the False King is at a distinct disadvantage against many of them. However, he does have a unique and powerful trump card, Soul Drain, if he manages to land this on Gwyn, Gael, or Vendrick, he could drain effectively all of their power. Whereas if he did it on Isshin, I mean, sure, maybe Isshin needs his soul to be alive, but losing soul power wouldn't necessarily affect him. He might be able to land it too on Gwyn and Vendrick. Both are relatively slow, and Gwyn even has his own grab that leaves him very open. Of course, we don't know how fast Vendrick was in his prime, but oh well. Neither of them were exactly known for their speed like Isshin and Gehrman. In the end, a puppet isn't going to be able to seriously contend with the others here, if you ask me. Even the true version of Allant isn't like to fare much better, but do tell me if you disagree. Vendrick, on the other hand, has a huge advantage in that he is by far the tankiest of the bunch, as it's doubtful any of the others would have giant souls to be able to deal with his gimmick. The only way to beat that is through sheer firepower, overwhelming the defense, which leads us to Gael, who might be the best all-rounder here. He's sturdy, he's fast, he's got magic and ranged attack, and he's good at melee, and immense willpower to carry him through against all the others. Purely looking just at his stats, he's got it good when it comes to health. With the magical attacks he gains in his final phase, he might be able to overwhelm Vendrick's defenses. Outside of the False King's soul drain, I don't see any distinct weaknesses the others could exploit against him. Considering Gwyn's status as a god, Gael's dark, if not occult, attacks might do very well against him, as would Vendrick's hex-like ability. Gwyn, after all, has an innate weakness to dark. Godfrey, one of the harder ones to figure out. He's strong, but can that pure strength really carry him to victory against the others here? How does he deal with magic? He has the most health, so he's durable, he towers over everyone else apart from Vendrick, and it's not like his offense is lacking. Even without magic, he can crack the ground and obliterate his enemies with powerful shockwaves, in true Souls fashion. So would a high-risk rushdown work on these others, his berserker-like rages? If he were able to tank through their damage and wipe them out, yeah, that's kind of his go-to though, right? He just seems to rush down. Ultimately, I think Gael and Vendrick are the strongest here, having the best all-round set of tools to lead them to victory against any of the others. Defense, offense, size, and speed. Vendrick we never saw in battle, only his mindless hollow form, which hits like an absolute truck, so in his prime, I think it's fair to assume he would have been pretty good. As for Gael, well, we have like the most amount of information on him. We see him as a boss, we see him as a summon. We know a lot about him, and we fought him in his prime, fighting against him in multiple phases, and we know everything. He's a suitably powerful final boss for the Dark Souls franchise, for the time being, so perhaps it's better to rank them in tiers, in which case I think it goes something like this. S tier, Gael and Vendrick. A tier, Gwyn and Godfrey. B tier, Isshin and Gehrman. C tier, Allant. But again, Allant, even if he is C tier, he has Soul Drain, which is a direct counter to Gael, Vendrick and Gwyn, if he can land it on them. Vendrick's weapon scales with souls, so it would be even stronger against him. It would be a way to somewhat circumvent his defense. But, well, what do you think? I hope you enjoyed this video. Go and check out some of the other versus ones I've done, if you did enjoy it. And if there's something similar you'd like to see, do let me know. Maybe you want to know who'd win between, I don't know, Jaime Lannister and Tamauth, or Dante versus every single Dark Souls boss. Till next time, thank you so much for watching, and see you later.